I bet you've heard that Tantra is all about hippie sex. Actually, it's about demons, shapeshifters, magic, ritual orgy, gods, gurus, and shagging on top of decomposing corpses. Okay, it's about a bunch of other stuff as well, but the point here is that it's as spiritually metal as you can get. Now, the crystal clutchers insist that a long time ago in India, everyone was so enlightened that they had cosmic sex all the time and that everything was super spiritual. They might fail to mention that people burnt their widows alive on funeral pyres and sold their 12-year-old daughters to rich old men as wives. Namaste, you pedos. The Tantra you've probably seen is New Age nonsense. The OG Tantras are secret spiritual teachings that come from Buddhism and Hinduism. They cover huge collections of practices spanning thousands of years. Precisely why trying to figure it out is a total fucking mess. Some scholars reckon that even trying to define Tantra succinctly at all is academically impossible. Lucky for you guys, I'm no academic, but I do love me some history, so let's go. Tribes migrating through what we now call Afghanistan during the Bronze Age found this dank valley called the Indus River system, one of the cradles of civilization and where Hindu spiritualism was born. Fast forward a few thousand years and you got yourself a flourishing population that starts producing tantric literature. Most of this scripture was composed in the 8th century, about the same time that the Vikings had just started raiding Europe. China had just invented fireworks by the time we hit what's called the Golden Tantric Age. By this point, Tantrism now dominates the Asian landscape, having traveled to China, Japan, and even as far as Bali. That's part of the reason why you'll hear 100 different conflicting ideas about Tantra, because it branched off into all these different countries, cultural styles, and interpretations. The unifying principle, though, is esotericism. By literal definition, this means only given to the initiated. So sure, you stopped getting wasted at raves, took up microdosing kombucha and went to Burning Man, but do you really think that this ancient, secretive, and super complicated spiritual knowledge can be taught to you by a white dude with a man bun talking about Kundalini awakenings and shit? Most people claiming to teach Tantra haven't been initiated into obscure secret teachings and cults, because they don't belong to those cultures or traditions. They appropriated them. So, how do we figure out what's legit and what's wank? Thankfully, many Indologists and professors and researchers have dedicated their entire careers to helping us idiots not be such spiritual basics. Now, to break this monster of a subject down, we're going to need 3 sections. 1, the word itself. 2, the origins of Tantra. And 3, this modern phenomenon called Neo-Tantra. Part 1. Tantra is an ancient Sanskrit word that describes a type of rudimentary weaving. As the systems of making tapestry became more complex, so did the meaning of the word, and it came to symbolize systematic instruction. After a bunch more time, it becomes adopted as a term for any written teaching, specifically those found in spiritual books. So voila, Tantra equals scripture. That's all you need to remember. Tantras are scriptures. Now, unlike Western gospel, this stuff was of a more instructive nature. Need the blueprints to build a temple? Yeah, there's a Tantra about that. If you want to know what, when, where, and how you should eat, drink, pray, and act for maximum holiness, there's Tantras about that. There's thousands of them, but not many of them are actually about sex. In the 20th century, some Californian hippies cherry-picked from the small fraction that actually are, in order to justify selling books to your dad on how to find the clitoris. But I digress. Let's get to part 2. So, Indo-Aryan tribes migrating into India 2,000 years ago brought their pagan rituals, which made love children with the local customs. Now, unless you have one of these handy, it's impossible to know what actually went down all that time ago, but what we can do is trace proto-tantric traditions like Shiva cults. Now, even though they were Shiva cults, some of them worshipped this badass guy called Bhairava, the god of terror. Now, this guy was punk as fuck. He got famous for decapitating the creator of the entire universe and used his skull as a begging bowl. Some of his proponents, the Kapalika, roamed funeral grounds, meditated on rotting corpses, and generally broke any and all spiritual and social conventions that they could, like drinking alcohol and eating the flesh of animals and humans. The idea here was that if God is everything, then why should one thing be more holy than anything else? And how can something be bad if everything is divine? What if death and dancing and singing and shagging could be spiritual tools? What if the oppressive caste system could go eat a bag of dicks? What if the priestly pompous Brahmins weren't actually more spiritual than anyone else? Even more radical and upsetting was that Tantric initiation was open to anyone, including women. In fact, women and the feminine archetype play a central role in Tantrism. This new radical wave took India by storm, coming to dominate politics, art, culture, and the spiritual landscape of the entire subcontinent. Traces of its impact still survive to this day. Wealthy philanthropists hoping to curry favor with tantric deities erected grandiose temples featuring their images. Regional kings held elaborate ceremonies to tantric gods to gain luck before their military campaigns to conquer other regions. At weddings, these kings would dress themselves as Shiva and their brides as yoginis, fearsome female deities that could morph into jackals, tigers, and seductive succubuses. There are some famous temple ruins still standing where you can see intricate carvings of pornographic scenes and bestiality. So ancient India was straight up Game of Thrones, not so much a spiritual paradise. I could go on all day about this, but we only have so much time before your attention span wavers and you fuck off over to TikTok. Exactly what modern day influencers are counting on. People don't really give a shit if something is historically accurate or authentic. They just want to feel good in their yummy parts. Which brings us neatly to part 3. Now, if you have extensively bought into the New Age sacred sex narrative, then this next bit might be a shock and you'll probably leave me YouTube comments. But the fact is, Neo-Tantra began in 1962, and that's a generous date. It's not old, it's not necessarily spiritual, and it does not come from an ancient lineage of gurus in India and Tibet. It's a modern form of group counseling that was started in California by a bunch of rock star philosophers and psychologists at this controversial place called SHA-Man. How come you've never heard of it? Maybe because you're too busy scrolling the gram for babes doing reverse warrior on a beach in Ibiza instead of reading a fucking book. SHA-Man was a research institute founded by 2 Stanford psychologists. Disillusioned by the rigidity of Western modalities, they decided to focus on humanistic psychology with a heavy Eastern influence. Dick Price and Michael Murphy were assisted by an all-star lineup, including Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, Buckminster Fuller, Dr. Abraham Maslow, and Alan Watts. By focusing exclusively on the education of the body and the emotions, SHA-Man challenged the established therapeutic narrative, claiming that a human being is simply more than a sum of its rational mental parts, and thus Gestalt psychology was born. Other groundbreaking ideas were birthed here, such as bioenergetics, the idea that unexpressed emotions cause blockages in the human energy field and impede the full expression of well-being. Weekend workshops involved complete mental and physical nudity, and things called encounter groups were deeply influential in shaping the course of Neo-Tantra. Don't forget that this stuff was radical for the time, and many people left SHA-Man changed forever. The idea that your mental energy was a mystical sexual force called Kundalini was heavily promoted. Psychedelics most likely featured quite heavily, and pretty much all of the New Age ideas that the modern Western seeker takes for granted were all propagated here. Bodywork, transpersonal psychology, the mind-body-soul connection, all of this was pioneered by some of the most intrepid psychonauts who ever lived. So I think we all owe a lot to this place and its founders. Unfortunately, it's now clear that some Esalen acolytes understood precious little about the vast, complex intricacies of Eastern spiritual systems. Alan Watts was one of the rare few who did, but, he wasn't in charge of the place. Another, called Fritz Perls, the guy who actually coined the term Gestalt psychology and lived in residence at Esalen for 5 years, left in disgust, declaring that he, and I quote, saw young people without any training leading encounter groups and feared that charlatans would take the lead. These so-called charlatans did exactly that, and went on to publish bestsellers and then claim themselves as experts and masters. These writers and workshop leaders took what little they knew from tantric esotericism and blended it with Western stuff like sexology, psychotherapy, self-transformational techniques, and couples intimacy coaching. And what did they call this brand new innovation? Yeah, you guessed it, Tantra. I think using that word was a shitty tactic because it infers a lineage of authenticity that isn't really there. But here we are, going on about spilt milk. The takeaway is that Neo-Tantra was invented by Westerners for Westerners in 1970s California. And that's okay. This new innovation is unique, groundbreaking, and valuable. I mean, it's helped a lot of people feel really good, especially your mum and dad. No wonder it hit the West like an atomic bomb. Sacred sex was booming in 70s California, coinciding perfectly with the zeitgeist of sexual revolution, flower power, anti-war and feminist countercultures. It dovetailed with LSD-fueled academia and legendary revelations like Woodstock, all surfing high atop an imported tidal wave of Asian-themed art, music, and culture. So is it any wonder that no one bothered to check the boring historical facts or figure out if the authors of these books were legit or not? Everyone was too busy ushering in the age of Aquarius. And rock on, I say, but 50 years on from the most radical innovations in psychosexual spiritual therapies led by the most preeminent minds of the time, and where have we ended up, guys? A confusing, convoluted, multi-billion-dollar wellness industry where influencers will do anything to convince you that Asian cultures had sacred sex all the time and that, for a hefty price, you can too. Now, as previously mentioned, I'd rather stake my money on the reality that these ancient cultures were probably doing exactly what everyone is still doing today, trying to get power, get laid, and make money. On those notes, please subscribe. Don't just take my word for it. Ask any modern Hindu about Tantra, and they'll most likely stare at the floor and shuffle their feet uncomfortably. Modern Hindus have zero connection to sacred sex, but will be happy to give horny backpackers directions to the bestiality carvings. So, just like yoga, the West took an ancient tradition obscured by time and molded it into something that would make us feel better, along with a bunch of money. And I got no problem with that. I just want you guys to know what's what so you can decide for yourselves. Right, let's recap and get out of here. That's if anyone is still listening. Neo-Tantra is a modern form of group therapy for people who want to feel more intimacy and expression in their lives. Original Tantra is an ancient universe of esoteric spiritualism. You might be interested to know that some of the ancient cults that have helped us trace proto-tantrism are still alive. Kula or Kaula and certain other Shiva sects still engage in anti-Vedic or anti-traditional practices. Their spiritual anarchy endures, with offerings of sex fluids to their gurus and gods, and they still to this day smear themselves in funeral ash and play music on instruments fashioned from human bones. Fine for them, but when I do that, I get kicked out of the Tantra festival. I've lectured at and attended some of the biggest hippie Tantra fests in Europe, and most of the people I met in those scenes really just needed some proper therapy and counseling, in my opinion. A lot of them were broken, toxic, and even sexually predatory personalities. And hey, that was just the teachers. Now, if you do like your therapy in groups and you want to share your most personal stuff with strangers who aren't licensed professionals in a drum circle, then cool, you do you. But whatever you want to do, keep your wits about yourselves Stay safe, informed, and know what you're handing over your hard-earned cash for. I hope you've enjoyed this whirlwind tour of the T word, and please share this video if you like it.